Greetings. My name is Carey Roberts, and it is my honor and my privilege to present to you the David Aldrich Nelson lecture in constitutional jurisprudence. I'm very grateful to his legacy, to those who knew him, and his ability to sense how important constitutionalism remains for Americans of all ages. I'm also grateful for the Alexander Hamilton Institute for helping to sponsor this lecture. I'm standing at Red Hill in Charlotte County, Virginia. This is the last home of the famed American revolutionary Patrick Henry. And just feet behind me is Patrick Henry's final resting place. He moved here in the last few years of his life, but in 1774, he remained in Hanover County, Virginia. And it was from there that he journeyed late in the summer to Philadelphia to serve as one of the delegates to the First Continental Congress. There he joined George Washington and a number of other important leaders of what would become the American Revolution. But only a few people at Philadelphia really knew Patrick Henry. Some knew him by reputation alone, and most really did not have a sense of how important he had been in protesting the Stamp Act years before, and fewer still understood his mastery of oratorical skill. It did not take long for everyone to understand what Patrick Henry was capable of saying. In the opening days of the Congress in September of '74, he stood before them and said, "We are now in a state of nature. We are no longer Pennsylvanians, Virginians, or Carolinians. We are now all Americans." That statement must have been quite startling to the delegates of the Continental Congress. Yes, they certainly thought of themselves as residents of their colonies, but most were probably dedicated to local areas within those colonies, like the northern neck of Virginia, where George Washington was from. But most were united not with a sense of being Americans, but with a sense of being English. They were there ostensibly to protest the British government and Parliament intervening in their trading relationships, trying to control their economies, and in their minds sacrificing their ancient rights as Englishmen for the good of pecuniary interest in London and in other major English trading cities. Henry, however, recognized that things had already gone too far, that the authority of British institutions was already sinking fast, if not already beyond reclamation. For Henry, we were in a state of nature because we were in a constitutional crisis. And that constitutional crisis indicated that the old regime and the institutions attached to it were already crumbling. They had already decayed beyond repair, and the corruption was already so deep-seated that there was little hope of making any changes. John Adams later wrote, after observing Henry, that Henry was the only member of the First Continental Congress who truly grasped the enormity of their situation. That First Continental Congress did not adopt Henry's boldest claims and measures. Instead, they decided to keep protesting and to try and follow an economic embargo as a means of making British leadership understand their interests. Months later, their peaceful effort to dialogue with the British government turned to violence on the green of Lexington and in the streets of Concord, Massachusetts. Henry understood how important it was to maintain a steady focus to liberty, maintaining one's personal virtue, but ensuring that as a constitutional crisis was endured, what was best and honorable in the previous constitutional regime ought to be preserved. Yes, he said we were in a state of nature, but that did not mean that Henry believed all things must be permanently swept aside. I want to spend a few minutes discussing a series of constitutional crises that Americans have endured over the past 200 years. It is my argument that we are in a constitutional crisis not unlike what was experienced during the American Civil War and what was experienced during those fateful years of the American Revolution. But before we begin, I want to establish two important ground rules. The first is the meaning of the word Constitution. I do not mean written constitutions, nor do I mean just the Constitution of 1789 that the various state conventions ratified for Americans to live under. No, I'm hearkening back to an older understanding of the word Constitution, one that Patrick Henry would have understood. The Constitution that reflects the general health of a given society, its fortitude, its foundational structures. It's the things that give meaning to the everyday interaction between people and their communities on a daily basis. It's not simply a written framework in which government, political action, and the legal system function. Think of it as someone who has a good constitution ought to be a healthy person. The second rule is what is meant by the word founding. The great historian and conservative intellectual Russell Kirk often remarked that it was a mistake to talk about the American founding. It forces us to think that something new was created in the 1770s and 80s that swept away everything in the past. And yes, Patrick Henry's talk of a state of nature might give credence to that. But Kirk, like Henry, insisted that no things were truly ever washed away. And even in a time in which new constitutions might be created, or a new health and vitality provided to an existing constitution, what was good and noble in the past endured. So the idea of a founding is a little bit of a troublesome term. Most Americans in the 19th century did not refer to the 1780s as a founding. They were more likely to speak of fathers, that the fathers who created their colony, the fathers who led the revolution, the fathers, like Patrick Henry, who were so committed to their liberty and freedom, were the ones who deserved memory and reverence. They would eventually start using the term founding fathers to explain the specific people that they were talking about. But it would not be until the year 1916 when Warren G. Harding at the Republican convention that year used the phrase founding fathers to refer to the men who put together the United States Constitution of 1789. Now, Henry was not there in the summer of '87, and yes, Henry opposed its ratification the following year in the Virginia Ratifying Convention. But Henry, no doubt, is as much a part of the Founding Fathers as anyone else. Subsequent to Harding's use of the term Founding Fathers, academics, historians, and others began separating founding and fathers to where we use the phrase today, the founding, to reflect what was going on in America at the end of the 18th century. We have had multiple foundings in the sense that we have endured multiple constitutional crises. And each time that these crises have occurred, men have chosen to protect and preserve certain fundamental rights and liberties that are steeped in the ancient history of the English-speaking people. Many of these rights go back to the time of the Saxons and Alfred the Great. Some were brought forward from France and the Gauls by way of the Norman invasion. Many were codified in the Magna Carta in 1215. And that constitutional tradition of liberties and customs and law continued to shape the English-speaking people for centuries to come. When the colonists began arriving in North America and established permanent settlements in 1607, they brought that abundance of constitutional packaging and baggage with them. They were able to transplant those things. If not intentionally, they certainly transplanted those things by way of tradition. It was, after all, how they lived their lives. But by the time we reached the end of the colonial period, a constitutional crisis had emerged, and it was based on a series of patterns that would be replicated in future constitutional crises and foundings over the course of American history. First, the constitutional framework that covered North American society was based on certain types of prescriptions and virtues. People led a certain way of life which sustained their dedication and the authority of those constitutional institutions, what constituted their society. Second, multiple institutions had grown up to support this overall constitution. This included major colonial institutions, colonial assemblies. It included religious denominations. It included enterprises and trading associations. It included companies and other ways in which human beings came together on a regular basis to improve their life and the lives of others. So the Constitution was a variety of institutions. Third, Americans relied heavily on the eve of the Revolution upon custom and tradition to govern their life. They were not seeking ways in which to recreate human society. They had already tried that in the century before, and in every single occasion in which colonial founders had a vision of order for their new colony, those visions quickly fell apart. As a result of that, colonial North Americans fell back on the things they knew best, what they were as Englishmen. And so there was a healthy appreciation of custom and the kind of rhythm of daily life that those customs produced. Finally, this constitutional order required a certain set of virtues for it to be properly sustained. And the British colonial order required the virtues of civic republicanism. This meant that people were always thinking of the common good, the commonwealth. They were always thinking of how they might have to sacrifice their personal interests in order to better their society as a whole. Because they knew that by bettering society as a whole, they would eventually welcome the benefits that accrue to themselves individually. That their families and their posterity would live in a socially stable world which enabled them to be wealthy, healthy, and wise. But in the years leading up to the American Revolution, those virtues were cast aside. They had begun eroded. They had become exhausted. People in London and in Parliament and the highest branches of the British Crown were losing the virtues needed to sustain a healthy empire. They were becoming callous and allowing their personal pecuniary interests to triumph over the good of the Commonwealth as a whole. As a result of that, the colonists grew uneasy. Their interests were not honored. The careful balance that existed in the empire began to crumble and collapse. And in turn, consolidated vestiges of power began to emerge in the empire, which dictated to the colonists not only their trading relationship, but began dictating even the most private parts of their lives: religion, marriage, inheritance. And in a series of, let's call them political arrhythmias, the political heart of the empire began skipping beats. Now, you can survive that, but the problem is that when that arrhythmia increases in frequency and the distance between the instances shrinks, the body politic eventually collapses. And if the institutions are already corrupt and eroded, then it's unlikely that they're going to be repaired. Hence, the constitutional crisis that was the American Revolution. Eventually, despite Patrick Henry's opposition, Americans ratified the U.S. Constitution by way of their state ratifying conventions. Henry came on board recognizing that new institutions would be built and new institutions would require a new way of doing things. And he was at the forefront of establishing those kinds of institutions in Virginia. It's one of the reasons why he moved here to Charlotte County. These new institutions, this new Constitution, the one you and I know and love as the Constitution of 1789, required a new set of virtues in order for those institutions to be sustained. Whereas in the 18th century, it was civic republicanism, self-sacrifice, and the maximizing the good of the Commonwealth for all, what mattered most for antebellum Americans was what I might call federal virtue. It was an insistence on honor and maintaining the integrity of the distinct cultural, economic, religious, and political cultures and institutions and regions that formed early America. It was a federation. It was a federal republic. It wasn't just any republic. It wasn't just any kind of democratic regime. As a federation, it required people to live a certain way. And honoring each other's differences in a way that gave weight and credence to those differences meant that Americans had to exercise tolerance. Now, this is not the kind of tolerance that would become common in British liberalism in the 19th and 20th century. This was a kind of tolerance that insisted that though I did not like what another region of the country was practicing or doing, or what another religious denomination held dear, or what another family had as their most important and cherished traditions, while I may not like those things, I would guarantee the integrity of those differences and ensure that others did not rise up to purposefully destroy them. This is what made American constitutions so important in the early 19th century. In 1804, the 12th Amendment was ratified to the U.S. Constitution. From 1804 to 1865, the Constitution would not be amended again. It's the longest period in American history in which no amendment took place. And yet, it coincides with this incredible outburst of constitution making within the United States. Between 1804 and 1865, no less than 48 new constitutions would be created in the old states and in the new states that came into the Union. 48. And it wasn't just an American thing. It wasn't just a phenomena in the United States. All over the world, there was this golden era of written constitutions. Between 1800 and 1880, over 60 countries adopted written constitutions. Now that may not seem like much to you, 60. Americans created 48. Keep in mind that in the summer of 1787, there were fewer than 50 countries in the world, so that 60 would eventually create constitutions in that period is phenomenal. Written constitutions allowed us to see when institutions and powerful people violated the rules governing society. They were meant to restrain government. They were meant to keep everybody in their proper lanes. They were meant to ensure that all of those different interests that were important in a society were maintained and their integrity preserved. Written constitutions were meant to balance society and prevent any one person, thing, or other institution from monopolizing power and then abusing that power. This is the substance of what constitutionalism 19th century Americans gave to the world. You must maintain balance. You must prevent concentrations of power, and you must ensure that those things that matter most to human beings receive due honor. Well, 19th century Americans didn't necessarily do a great job with that. And not too many miles from this very spot, battles of the Civil War raged with an intensity the world had not yet seen to that point. 1 million men were killed or wounded in what was a great constitutional crisis. It resulted from a dissipation of that federal tolerance and other virtues needed to keep federalism energetic and active. It resulted from institutions decaying in time and becoming intellectually exhausted. It occurred because leadership began to dissipate. The generations that knew the founding generation had become disconnected and no longer had the same commitments. It is often said that new technology started the Civil War, technology like the telegraph. As the historian Clyde Wilson used to tell his students, the telegraph enabled Americans to insult each other instantaneously. In the fields of Virginia, those insults turned to violence. There is much of the old Constitution that endured the Civil War, but not all of it did. There was much that continued to appear in form, but not appear in substance. Even the political traditions of that earlier constitutional order did not necessarily survive the Civil War intact. A new constitutional regime was created, one that harnessed the power of new types of institutions, massive corporations and financial enterprises, railroad companies, steel companies, agricultural companies, massive companies that could move massive numbers of people and goods and services from one place to another. The virtues that people championed were no longer civic republicanism or tolerance. They championed virtues of individualism, profit, and the importance of raising standards of living, not only for those that matter the most to you, but also for your customers. This constitutional order would last roughly another 70 years. But the ravages of World War I and the harm of the Great Depression caused many people to begin questioning if that order could long be sustained. In fact, for the better part of a generation, progressive reformers had gradually chipped away at the authority of that previous constitutional order, arguing that what Americans needed was not a return to the Constitution, but what Americans needed was a new way of governing themselves. But there was still enough residue of the old order, enough commitment to balance and the integrity of interests, that enough Americans halted a lot of the worst of progressive era reforms. Now, you may not see it as such, but a good example of that hesitation was the creation of the Federal Reserve Act after World War I. In fact, one of the leading sponsors of that act was Carter Glass, whose home is just a few miles from this location. Carter Glass and others had enough dedication to the original founding of America that they understood the need to separate interests and to prevent a consolidation of power. It's why they designed a Federal Reserve System. Their hope was to forestall New York banks from gaining the upper hand over the American economy. Their goal was to protect state banks and local banks. And while their goals may not have been fulfilled in the long term, that was nonetheless their intentions. But by the time of the Great Depression, and what was beginning to become obvious to most in the 1930s, that Franklin Roosevelt's ambitious New Deal was not making things better, that the creation of a vast new infrastructure of federal agencies and associated state agencies were not getting us out of the Depression, but were in fact causing the Depression to last longer, further weakening the economy and further damaging the lives of Americans. A group of congressmen began to emerge who understood that we were, in fact, in a third constitutional crisis, that the old institutions of the progressive era were not sufficient to reform and sustain the kinds of things that Americans needed to prosper. They recognized that the virtues of individualism and profit and consumerism were either not being properly taught or were being taken to absurd and cruel ends. And so these men began designing a new constitutional order. And I want to emphasize that, like Patrick Henry, many of these men were from the American South. They were from an area of the country that had been wrecked by war, that had been subject to a great many outside pressures to change their own society. But they resisted, both for good and for ill. They resisted and were able to preserve a lot of those institutions and the way in which human beings in the South lived on a daily basis. But as occurred in the first American constitutional crisis, when Virginians like Patrick Henry and Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and George Washington stepped forward, Southerners stepped forward again. Men like Sam Rayburn, Richard Russell, William Calmer of Mississippi, Lyndon Baines Johnson, William Fulbright of Arkansas, and perhaps more important than any of them, Cordell Hull of East Tennessee. These men began building new institutions, not just for the United States. They began building new institutions for the world. And while they were gripped in the heart of World War II, fighting totalitarian regimes, they were already at work trying to figure out how to create a new constitutional order that not only helped Americans, but would help all countries of the world. A good example of this would be at the beginning of Cordell Hull's career in 1934 when he sponsored the Reciprocal Trading Act, which allowed the President of the United States to begin creating trading relationships directly with other countries. But there were so many other things that Hull and his associates in Congress created. In 1944, the Bretton Woods Agreement created the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, which sustained the global gold dollar system that would generate incredible wealth for Americans and others in the world. In 1944, Congress passed the GI Bill, which would fundamentally change America's educational system. And I'll speak more about that in just a moment. In 1947, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade would be created that would fundamentally change global trade and begin creating all sorts of global financial and economic institutions. In 1948, the European Recovery Act would be passed, largely due to the efforts of this seldom heard of Mississippi Congressman William Calmer. It led to the creation of what we call today the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan itself demanded that these kinds of new institutions, this new constitutional order, would not be confined to the United States, but would be transplanted abroad. So in 1948, the North Atlantic Treaty would be created, which would produce NATO that we know today. In the early 1950s, Europeans would be required to come together to start building their own kind of new constitutional order. There was the Council of Europe, the European Coal and Steel Community, and in 1957, the Treaty of Rome created the European Economic Community, which today we know of as the European Union. And like that first constitutional crisis that gave us a series of important documents laying down the ideas and principles of that Constitution, like Jefferson's A Summary View, like Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, like John Dickinson's Notes of the American Farmer, or John Adams' dissertation. Or we could add Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural or his Gettysburg Address. This third constitutional order had its own kind of documents. The European Declaration of Rights, which would become the European, sort of their own Bill of Rights in the year 2000, was first started in 1950. But perhaps no institution represented this order more than Cordell Hull's most important contribution, and that was the United Nations, which also had its own Declaration of Human Rights. All of these institutions were not designed to create a world government. They were not the product of a conspiracy. There was no hidden, spooky deep state trying to hide their clandestine interests and to grow wealthy off the backs of global workers. All of these institutions were designed to forestall the consolidation of human power and to prevent one person, one thing, or one institution from exercising control over all the rest. Trade would be globalized so that no one company could dominate a country's entire economy. Politics would take on global importance so that local political machinations and issues could not take over an entire nation. New institutions were created. New virtues were needed, which is why I come back to the 1944 GI Bill. It was designed to ensure that all Americans would have access to the new virtues needed to make these institutions last. And at the time, it was insisted that these new global institutions required mastery of statistics, scientific management, and familiarity with international affairs. In the same way that civic republicanism was in the background of 18th century institutions, these post-war institutions required the social sciences to be in the background of them. If one was going to be virtuous, one needed to master the data. One needed to be able to use the tools of data to change and further the way people were living. Well, let me bring this to a close. These virtues were unsustainable. The social sciences failed to cure the momentous social problems that continue to exist throughout not only the United States, but also the rest of the world. In the meantime, new virtues were championed, which people unknowingly failed to see jeopardize the very institutions they thought were going to make the world better. New virtues that struck at the heart of human society, that sought to uproot human relationships and turn the abnormal into the normal, and to turn what is bizarre into the customary. It was a sentiment that all things are equal and therefore all things must be affirmed. In time, the authority of those global institutions came to be questioned. The hard work and tenacity that actually made them function well began to subside as hard work became synonymous with slavery. We are in a fourth constitutional crisis. And all the institutions that were built up in the 1940s to create the established constitutional regime in which we have lived, all of those institutions are collapsing around us. There is very little that you and I can do to stop that collapse. And I come back to Patrick Henry. There was very little that Patrick Henry could do to stop the collapse of British colonial institutions. He was committed to liberty and recognized that what was needed in such desperate times was moral clarity, courage, a love for the things that mattered most in life, and an insistence that liberty and freedom were more important than power. That institutions, once they had become corrupt, were likely beyond repair. And once people recognized this, it was long since too late to make any difference. But Patrick Henry also recognized there were three other important things that I challenge you to dedicate yourself to as well. First, that no matter how deep the constitutional crisis, all things will not be swept away. We must dedicate ourselves to preserving what is good, what is noble, what is meaningful and functional in the old constitutional orders so that we can carry those things forward. Make no mistake, friends, the post-war constitutional order of the United States lifted standards of living beyond anything anyone in all of human history had ever witnessed. 1947, my mother's family moved into a small cabin outside of Jackson, Mississippi. That was a cabin that had once been occupied by slaves. And yet she, like so many others in this period, eventually came to see men walk on the moon. An incredible display of abundance and wealth and health that the world has never seen, all due to those constitutional institutions. But Henry also understood that the institutions were made for us. We were not made for them. Patrick Henry, the great founding father, understood that constitutions are made for men. Men are not made for constitutions. And as we boldly move forward into the future, we will begin building new things. But we must first endure the dark times ahead, recognizing that providence and the goodness of the hopes that we cling to and the merits of our customs and traditions will lead us into a new world. Thank you.